And let's bring out our panelists. We have 4 panelists who have been doing business with Cuba for at least 20 years. We have panelists who travel to Havana on a regular basis on a charter flight, but it's almost a commuter flight, Miami-Havana. I'll introduce them each briefly. They will say a few words, and then we'll get the conversation going. So Hugo Cancio, who has been featured quite prominently recently in the news, travels to Havana probably weekly, is in Miami Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, takes a commuter flight Wednesday night, comes back on Saturday. Jay Brickman is with Crowley. They are the first and only shipper into the island from the U.S. He was one of the first folks suggested to us to be a speaker. Teo Babun has been talking about Cuba and doing business in Cuba for a very long time. At times has taken an academic research approach, at times has taken a very practical approach. He may have some exciting news to announce today towards investment opportunities and a fund that has been on the works. And Tom, you may have seen him in Barron's about 4 or 5 weeks back, talking about the Cuba fund, which is listed here, has been investing in Cuba for the last 20 years with the opportunities that may be there. He trades publicly traded equities, but they have had some debt in that Cuba fund, so that's how we outed you as a Cuba investor directly. And we'll start with Hugo, who will make a few remarks, and we'll talk a little bit about what Cuba will look like 10 years from now on more of a cultural and anthropological.
Well, thank you, Faquiry, for inviting me. Thank you all for being here and waiting so long. I appreciate it. When I start talking about Cuba, I always like to focus on the Cuban people. To me, that's Cuba's most important asset and value. It's the people itself. Cuba's national personality has been formed by many trades, from Hispanics to African, indigenous, and other cultures have contributed to what Cuba is today. It's a country of about 11 million people, a cultural powerhouse, a country that reminds me of those things that I respect, admire, and love the most. The Cuban people are the future of the country. The events of December 17th, in my personal opinion, transformed the hearts and minds of the people, set off that fire inside the heart of the Cuban people that for the first time in many years, they start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And for me, that's extremely, extremely important. And I think that's something that I like all of you to focus on, over and above the fact that we all are here because we're interested in doing business with Cuba. I like also for all of you to start thinking about how we could help the Cuban people advance their agenda and build a better future now that the two countries are finally getting in the right way or to set aside the differences and start building and normalizing relationships.
Jay has been helping the Cuban people by getting them a container a week out of the Florida shores. And Jay, tell us a little bit about your perspective.
Sure. Okay. In relation to communications and doing business with Cuba, and thinking from a corporate point of view, probably you need to look at communications from 3 different levels. And all of them are equally as important. The first one is you have to make sure that you have good communications within your own corporation. Because doing business in Cuba, just as in any other area, takes a lot of time, a lot of investment and energy, and you have to make sure that you have the corporate support to do that. Very honestly, if you don't have that, probably it's a project that you should back away from. Because while people become very, very impatient, and when is the U.S. going to change its law, and when is Cuba going to change its law, and if you're explaining that every day, you're going to have a difficult corporate life. So within communications, first thing is to make sure that you have good corporate communications internally. Secondly, you have to have good communications with the U.S. government, specifically with the triumvirate of OFAC, which is the Department of Treasury, BIS, which is the Department of Commerce, and with the State Department, so that you're sure that you understand what the regulations are in the U.S., and as those are changing, that you're complying with all of those to keep yourself out of trouble and to make sure that you can identify the opportunities that you want. And lastly, and certainly not last in order of importance, is to have good communications within Cuba itself. Very, very briefly, probably the question outside that has been asked me most is, but how are your communications with the Cuban government? And I would say that from our point of view, and I certainly hope from theirs, that they're excellent. The reason why, without going into a lot of detail, is that when we first began in Cuba, we basically had ships that couldn't go in and one thing and another. And what we learned from that is what you don't know, you really don't know. But the most important thing about not knowing what you don't know is how to react once you understand what it is you didn't know. And I think by being able to react to some not good situations at the very beginning of our service, we were able to establish a good, transparent relationship with the Cuban government based on mutual respect, and that's been extraordinarily important to us as we've moved on.
Thank you. And I'm going to come into Tom here. Tom has been involved with Cuba for a long time. You've been involved in various endeavors and investments in the public markets. I know that currently you're under quiet period, so we're not going to focus so much on the Cuba Fund. We're going to talk a little bit more as you speak to American investors, as you come into the Nasdaq where you're listed, as you speak to Barron's, Wall Street Journal. What are they asking you about Cuba? What are they saying in your own 20 years of expertise in the subject?
You know, it's a great question to start with, because today I learned so much in speaking with the people here and listening to the people on the platform. What I was afraid I was going to hear would have been a carpetbagger, predatory approach to going into Cuba, and quite to the contrary. What I heard were investors here who were interested in going to Cuba, and they share my view and Teo's view, and I think the rest of you, that this is a great opportunity not only for the United States to resume trade with Cuba, but for investors here to help build the Cuban economy and the middle class in Cuba, restore capitalism and freedom. It's a great opportunity for the United States now throughout Latin America to improve our relations, where Cuba has always been a sore point. So that's what I'm seeing now, today, and I'm so happy to see it.
Excellent. Teo, we conducted a survey as we launched this, and we have about $12 billion of investment capital that has expressed their interest in Cuba at this conference today. You guys have been doing some work in the subject. Maybe tell us a little bit, what's the outlook from the alternatives division of your group into Cuba and the investment opportunities there?
Well, as we're looking at investment opportunities, we have to look at at what is Cuba. You know, we haven't talked the whole day about the fact that Cuba probably has one of the best transportation systems in all of Latin America. We haven't talked about the fact that probably every town and city in Cuba is connected by paved roads, and that probably every industrial site in Cuba is connected by a railroad system that has the same gauge system as the United States. We talk about, you know, what does Cuba have to open, and we struggle a little bit with that. Well, the natural resources in Cuba, that includes limestone and sand and salt and granite and marble and basalt and mining products and the nickel and of course the tremendous amount of infrastructure work that's going to have to be needed in Cuba in water, sewer, sanitation, and the priority areas in energy, LPG facilities and bunker tank farms and power lines and the like, places Cuba at a really unique position as an emerging market and one of the last emerging markets and a true investment opportunity. But why do we look at investment? As Tom was mentioning, you know, we believe very strongly that foreign investments can bring about a better economic future for the people of Cuba and a positive change in Cuba. And so that's why we're participating in this emerging market, and that's why today we announced a private equity fund as a sister fund to the public equity fund, which will be called the Cuba Opportunity Fund, to make investments in companies that will benefit as the opportunities arises in Cuba.
What's the projected size of the fund?
The first series will be a $300 million fund, and we hope that by the end of the year we'll raise $500 million.
So if we think about it, and this is now opening to the four of you, we have $500 million willing to go into Cuba before 2015, so way earlier than one would expect it. Where do you think the opportunities lie inside the island for that money to be placed?
Well, not inside the island, except for perhaps telecommunication. It's outside the island where the opportunities lie for us, as we see it initially as our first phase, is being able to participate in businesses that will expand into Cuba. They'll be in the Caribbean, they'll be in the United States, they'll expand into Cuba, and they'll be, will be opportunistic as the United States and Cuba allow us to be able to come into the country.
So, Hugo, you have an operation today in Havana. It's publicly information. Tell us a little bit about what you are currently doing in the island.
Well, we have an official authorized new media desk in Cuba. I believe we are the second American news media outlet authorized to operate in Cuba. Our company is already registered in Cuba as well. We have about 78 journalists and executives all over the island. When we started the OnCuba project 2.5 years ago, we started as a small project. We started the project in Havana with about 5 journalists. 2.5 years later, we have a media platform that started with a magazine called OnCuba. That has national distribution in the United States, in Barnes & Nobles, different airports around the country, every public supermarket in the state of Florida, going into CVS as of September of 2015. We launched another magazine called Art on Cuba about a year ago. It has the same distribution with the exception that it's not part of the charter flight, not an in-flight magazine. And today we launched another magazine called OnCuba Real Estate. It's a high-end design and architecture magazine. The purpose of that is that we wanted to showcase a different Cuba. Cuba's national media for many years has been focused on praising the Cuban government and their agenda, and also in certain ways criticizing U.S. policy towards Cuba, among many other things. American media has always been on the other side, reacting to what Cuban media portrayed out there to be. And OnCuba found a space in the middle 2 years ago, to where we didn't have to take sides, and we didn't have to defend any political ideologies, and we have been extremely successful. We're not the El Nuevo Herald, we're not the Cuban state media, and this is why it has been our OnCuba project has been extremely successful. We're visited today by 1.2 million people visited our website last month, and we're very excited. We're now expanded all over the island, and we continue to expand our operation now into travel and telecommunications.
So one of the most interesting things I heard was you have 78 journalists that work or affiliated with your group, and I'll take it to each of you. Are they employees of the group? And I'll ask Jay as well. Does Crowley have Cuban employees today?
No. We work exclusively with an agency which is called Transcargo, and it's 100% Cuban government owned.
And in your case, Hugo?
They're all independent. We have about 11 people that are on our staff, permanent on our staff, and the rest collaborate, or freelancers that collaborate with our project.
Herzfeld, do you guys have operations in Havana today? Do you have collaborators?
Collaborators.
Excellent. So as we begin focusing now, looking ahead, let's look ahead 2 years from now, 5 years from now, and then 10 years from now. So 2 years from now, will we have seen this embargo lifted? Where will we be there? Whoever is brave enough to take that.
Well, I'll tell you one idea that we have presented to the United States government, which gets us over one hurdle. And Teo and I have been working together for over 20 years, and it's the issue of prior claims, of which Teo's family has one of the larger ones. I am a specialist in closed-end funds, And if you go to a general doctor with a stomach ache, they'll give you a pill. If you go to a surgeon with a stomach ache, they'll want to operate. Well, if you come to a closed-end fund specialist with a financial problem, we're going to give you a closed-end fund. And I believe that it is possible to solve the $6 billion prior claim problem using a closed-end fund. It would work as follows. With $6 billion in claims, if the Cuban government would take $750 million of undeveloped commercial properties on which there are no claims and put it into the Herzfeld Claims Fund, which is an SEC registration now, we would put $750 million in. We would then use the cash and develop the properties. We would give the prior claim holders the opportunity to exchange their claims for shares in the fund. So then they would have an opportunity to seek a fund that would be involved in rebuilding Cuba, and we would make it the first company listed on the Cuba Stock Exchange.
This will be a Brady bond program for Latin America for all the countries who defaulted. Susan is here. She negotiated some of those claims at one point, but for Cuban assets. Do you think this is doable in the next 2 years?
We intend to, I am hoping that diplomatic relations are resumed with Cuba, and we would ask the U.S. government if they like the idea to put it right at the top of the agenda.
Excellent. Hugo, where do you see things standing 2 years from now?
My goodness, I wish I had that crystal ball. Look, every time that I travel to Cuba, and I return to Miami and I go back to Cuba, I see a different Cuba. Businesses are flourishing everywhere. The people are excited, motivated. The Cuban government is opening up more and more to its own people in the island. Before they allowed foreign investors to come in, they have serious internal issues to take care of, like how to manage the discontent among some of the members of the Cuban government that were an important part of that government, that system, and now find themselves out of place with this economic reforms and this taking place. And that's a legitimate issue that the Cubans need to address. And this is why the changes are not going as fast as we all would like to see them. And I believe they're on the right track to do that. But 2 years from now, I see a totally different Cuba. I am one of those people that are hopeful that under this administration, the embargo will be lifted. We all know it's an obsolete and, in certain way, an inhumane measure that have stayed for 50 years that has only affected the Cuban people. And again, I always like to focus on the people because the people are the ones that are suffering the most. And as we all are thinking here of doing business, there are 11 million people out there that are in need of a better country, a better future. And so I'm hoping that 2 years from now, those changes and those businesses that we're proposing today will better the future of our country and our people.
Jay, infrastructure takes a little bit longer to build, so I'm going to give you the 5-year perspective. Where do you see, do you guys ship today into the Mariel port?
I'm sorry, we went?
To the Mariel port.
Yes, we go through Mariel.
You do. So maybe tell us a little bit about that current infrastructure. It's a multi-billion-dollar project that has taken place. The Brazilians have been very active there. Maybe tell us where you see infrastructure in Cuba 5 years from now.
Okay. Great deal of this has to do with the transitional period in Cuba. I mean, in 2 years, supposedly the Castros have announced they will be out of government. A lot happens. What happens with the Cuban approach toward relations with the U.S.? Supposing that they are basically normalized, I think what we would see in Mariel is the following. The Zona Industrial, which is the industrial zone of Mariel, is about 450 square kilometers, which means it's a fairly substantial zone. It is very different than from a free zone in the sense that the Zona Industrial actually incorporates the industries within that zone in the economy of Cuba. And when you look at some of the key things that are involved in investing, and what the Cubans are trying to attract is $2.2 billion a year over the next 5 years, each year. People are looking for security of, okay, what is the security of my investment? What is my tax structure? What kind of guarantee do I have in relation to remittance of profits? And what is my labor structure? And there is a very special structure set up for all of that in relation to the industrial trade zone. From a logistics point of view, when you look at the industrial trade zone and compare it with some of the free zones, say, in Central America, you have maybe 4.5 days from a port like Miami down to those zones. They then will perhaps start in Honduras and then go over to Nicaragua, come back. So you have the time involved in that, plus the additional cost, and then the cost to get product back. When you look at the industrial zone, supposing we have normalized relations and commerce with the U.S., you probably are about 12 to 16 hours from your Florida market with the raw material down into the trade zone or the industrial zone. You're about 12 hours back, which means you're closer than a lot of plants within the United States itself. So it opens up an incredible flow for the investment in processing of all kinds of goods flowing between the United States and Cuba. So I think in 5 years, supposing normalized trade and political relations, that we should see a really significant boom in the industrial trade zone in Mariel.
So you're saying we have the opportunity to have light infrastructure, assembly plants, and you have a logistical chain that can actually be much better and easier than some other places in Latin America today.
That's correct, yes.
That's an interesting thought. Not a lot of people have talked about this, the same as not a lot of people have talked about the idea of a closed-end fund for the claims, which is actually something that's very important. I think what we're going to do now is really begin with the audience. Let's take some questions from the audience. Let's get the mic runners ready to go. As we think about those questions, 10 years from now, who will venture to say, where do we stand in Cuba?
Where do we stand in Cuba?
Yes.
Well, I think we have two models that we need to look at, Frankie. One is Burma as a model of where the administration has very aggressively done a number of things that that we're seeing that is happening in Cuba. We're lagging about 1.5 years behind Burma. But the best model is the Vietnamese model. 2 countries with embargoes, 2 countries with currency unification problems, 2 countries with very similar processes. And we have seen the development and the changes that have taken place in Vietnam and can very much assume that based on the discussions that have been taking place between the Vietnamese and the Cubans, that the Cubans are taking lessons from the Vietnamese and that we can see the same kind of changes developing in Cuba over time.
This Vietnam concept is something we'll come back in a little bit later because we actually have some experience in the matter. We have a question in the back.
Yes, thank you. Thomas, the investment fund looks really interesting. Can you maybe say a little bit from a U.S. regulatory perspective, to the extent you're able to talk about it, what kind of authorization did you have to seek from OFAC to set up the fund, and what kind of authorizations would you need to be looking for to make investments out of the fund?
Before we do that, can you identify yourself?
I'm Scott Mayberry, Shepard Mullen, Washington, D.C.
Excellent, thank you.
We have a public fund that invests in publicly traded securities, a private equity fund, and the fund in registration, which would be for the claims. Which fund were you speaking about? The private equity. Maybe Teo would like. Teo runs the fund.
We don't. The private equity fund can't invest, nor any of the companies that will co-invest with or invest in Cuba until the U.S. government allows us to. So it's a non-issue. I mean, we're going to do the fund. We're going to raise the funds. We don't need OFAC for that. It's a private equity fund, and the investments will be in companies operating in the Caribbean and the United States. So in the future, when they give us the green light, we'll go into Cuba.
And if you guys are familiar, there's a fund that's traded out of the Channel Islands that Baxberger runs called Saba Investments. It's audited. Hugo, I believe they share office space in the same tower where you're at, or you have seen them in Havana. The guys at Saba today How do they operate?
They have a foreign corporation. It's not a U.S. corporation. They have large investments in real estate in Cuba and hotel stakes. They are the Miramar Trade Center. We are, a little bit farther, a little bit into the center of Havana in the city of Vedado. But they're very successful. They have been around for a long time. And I believe they're now in the process of becoming a publicly traded company.
So there you have a private equity fund operating. They've been operating in Havana since 1994 or so, when Sebastian Berger set up shop. We have Seva Investments. Seva. Yes. Next question right here in the front. Professor Henkin.
Yes, I'm Ted Henkin. Hugo, I have a question for you, but first I want to call out your modesty. You said that your magazine is not political, and I agree, but it doesn't mean it's light. I actually used a lot of the reporting that's on the web for the book Entrepreneurial Cuba. There's a lot of really good reporting, investigative reporting, and things you really don't find anywhere else, not just because it's not politicized, but the reporters dig into the Cuban reality. So I commend you for being behind that, and I wish it the best. I have a similar question about doing journalism in the new Cuba as they had about the equity fund, and I guess I'll make the question simple and direct. What's your secret? Because that is a very tenuous and polarizing area, journalism, independent journalism, publishing a magazine that's printed, not just online. I follow the independent press, the government press, the foreign, the Cubans abroad who write about Cuba. And your project occupies a very unique space. I'm hoping that it can be a pioneer for others, but I'm just wondering if you could tell us some of the strategies and challenges of doing that and establishing it, keeping it open. Thank you.
But don't give us the ports that you'll be using once you launch your cruise ships.
Well, listen, there's no strategies. There's a lot of passion, a lot of persistence, a lot of perseverance, a lot of vision. We position ourselves many years ago. We, under the guidelines of the comments made by the President Raul Castro and Vice President Diaz-Canel, which call out the national media to be more open, to start digging more. Unfortunately, that has not taken place. It has been a very slow process for Cuban journalists that work for state-owned media to open up. You cannot change things overnight after 56 years. It's a process that is going to take a little bit. How we decided, instead of importing American journalists into Cuba, I personally decided that I wanted to work with young journalists, young Cuban journalists. Some of them work for state-owned media. And you could see sometimes they write an article in Juventud Rebelde or Granma, and then they write over the same issues and on Cuba with a different perspective. And that is because of Cuba has offered them a platform to where they could express themselves without being marginalized or told you should not write about this. We have, in a way, pushed the envelope, but within, with respect, with a lot of passion towards what we're doing. We have a commitment to be critical, but at the same time respectable. Respect, others. We're not into calling the Cuban president the dictator. That doesn't apply to OnCuba. We could probably criticize them in many ways. We have criticized the government in many ways, or policies in many ways, but from a point of view that there's a responsible journalists that have a compromise with their country. They love their country, their country of origin, and they want to see a better Cuba. And on those guidelines, we have been able to push the envelope a little bit. We continue to do it. We report news from Cuba as it happens on a daily basis. It hasn't been easy. I have to spend, every time that I go to Cuba, I have to set aside 1 or 2 hours to explain or to defend what we're doing to some Cuban officials. And I'm happy to do so, and I've been successful enough to defend it because now we're seeing a different Cuba. We're seeing a Cuba in a way to where we could establish a conversation with Cuban officials and tell them, hey, look, you know, what is it you don't like about this particular article? It's the truth. And we have a responsibility to our readers. And we have a commitment to our readers to report the truth as it happens. We're not going to hide it just because you don't like it or just because, you know, we get in trouble sometimes also with my Miami friends as well, where we're not critical enough of the Cuban government. So, you know, we are walking on shallow waters, but I'm humble and grateful for the opportunity, and we'll continue to move on. And you know, this is the key why we're being extremely successful.
So I wanted more questions from the audience as we line up.
Andres Von Hool here. Since you brought up the claims issue, which is a very complicated issue, you know, this happened in 1961, and there were people that were actually damaged by things that happened. But along the way, there's been speculators of claims that people have bought claims or ended up with claims here and there. And under our interpretation of the law is that, you know, you are only allowed to receive what you actually purchased that claim for if you did not have actual standing in the claims. How, as you review the claims, how are you going to identify which were the real claimants and which are speculators?
Well, I think Tom was referring to the U.S. registered claims with the U.S. Claims Commission. We can't speculate beyond that into the Cuban national claims. You know, I think that trying to value what the Van Hool's claim is, or the Babun's claim is, or the whoever else's Cuban national claims are that did not get an opportunity to be registered anywhere or verified anywhere or vetted anywhere is a whole other issue. We do hope that, however, that this project, this idea, this tremendous, brilliant project that Tom is bringing to the table to the U.S. and the Cuban government would then, if successful with the registered claims, will then be able to attract the Cuban national claims later. Now, we do know that the Cuban government is aware. We know that they keep all of the properties well guarded, and so that the issue of the Cuban claims could follow that process sometime later. But it's not up to us to verify or to vet those claims. We do know what you stated a little earlier, that OFAC is in the middle right now, that you can't do anything with your claim unless you get a special permission from OFAC to do that. And I don't know very many OFAC licenses that allow the sale of a potential claim.
I'm talking specifically about the U.S. certified claims. That's what I mentioned originally.
Well, the U.S. certified...
And there is trafficking in
yes.
U.S. certified claims.
Andres, let me step in for the audience so it's clear. The focus here is very simple. You have vulture investors, just like you have in Argentina, some of them who are present here, some of them who are my great friends. These guys have bought in London or elsewhere these claims anywhere from 9 to 12 cents on the dollar. When you are in the U.S. law has actually codified that if you were to buy these claims at 9 or 10 cents and the claims pay off at 300 at some point because you add interest, you add compound, you add value, you actually cannot get any more than your 9 or 10 cents that you first used when you purchase your claim. That has been driven to a great extent by the Cuban American community in Congress and so forth. And where we are today is what's going to happen overall with these claims. So the audience has this clear. Does the panelists have additional thoughts on the matter?
No, we're depending on the Claims Commission to dialogue on the issue, and they haven't, of course, as you know, they're very much quiet on the whole issue, and until such time as they are willing to begin that dialogue, it's very difficult to know where how to proceed.
So as Michelle would ask, are you long on the claims right now, or are you short on the claims?
We don't trade in claims.
Excellent.
Yes.
We have time for one last question from the audience.
Just
If you
want
could
to echo what
identify
the
yourself.
gentleman said here. Sorry, Jonathan Blue, private equity firm Blue Equity LLC. Just first, I want to echo what the gentleman said here about Hugo, and thank you for making it easier for us to do things in Cuba by bringing the positive image to this country. We appreciate it. I have a question for Jay. I guess just a prediction, if you could give us a prediction. If the embargo is not lifted in the near term, will categories extend where we will be able to ship things through you and others into Cuba if the embargo doesn't change? Or will the categories stay the same and will be fixed for a while until it is lifted? Just a prediction.
Okay, I think there are two sides to this. Quite often we refer to the paper of December the 15th from the White House or the OFAC January 16th. There's another side, which happens to be Cuba. Cuba, I think, one, has some economic challenges, so that will depend on what sort of money do they have to import. Secondly, I think Cuba is very concerned about if the embargo is not lifted and things continue to be a presidential decree, we're going to have an election in 2 years. What one president has given, another president can take away. And so I think there's concern about how much faith and how much do they want to put into the American market without the certainty that the embargo is going to go away. And the third thing, and nobody nominated me to speak for Cuba on this, but my feeling is that there is a feeling in Cuba that they don't want to be overly dependent upon the United States, that they've been through that. They went through it with the Soviet Union. They're now struggling with that in Venezuela. And so I think they would try to be as diversified as possible. And then I guess the last point on this particular part, Cuba has got to have credit. And if the embargo doesn't go away, there's not going to be credit to finance the flow of U.S. products. So I think if the embargo stays, we will probably see some increase in U.S. trade, perhaps more soya, a little bit more in the grain products, more rice and wheat, and maybe some cargo that can be containerized. But I don't think it will nearly come to the potential that it could if the embargo stays in place.
Thank you so much, Jay. And with that, we'd like to thank our wonderful panel as they looked ahead fearlessly.